Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from anthonymorganti.com. You're looking at a Fujifilm X100t, and in this video we're going to talk about the menu settings for this camera. Now, what you have to make sure is that you're using the current firmware from Fujifilm. As of the making of this video, the current firmware is version 1.11. To test what firmware is on your camera, turn the camera off, then hold the display back button in while turning the camera on. And you can see that the current firmware loaded on this camera is version 1.11. If you don't have the current firmware, go to Fujifilm's website. There you could download it, and there are detailed instructions on Fujifilm's website on how to install it. Now, to clear this screen, we just have to turn the camera off, then turn it back on. Now, we're going to talk about two different menu systems in this camera. The first is the shooting menu, and the shooting menu is divided up into 5 different groups. Then we're going to talk about the setup menu, and the setup menu is divided up into 3 different groups. So we're going to start off with the first group on the shooting menu, and the very first choice is autofocus settings. And when we go into that, there's a number of settings in this sub-menu. The first being focus area. Now, before I tell you about focus area, I'm going to jump down here to AF mode. You'll see right now that I have it set to area mode. That's what I prefer to have my camera set at. When I'm in area mode, I could select the specific focus point I want to use. So I could focus on like somebody's eye, or I could focus on something in the foreground of a landscape image, something like that. And I could move the focus point around. If you're in multi-mode, you're allowing the camera to choose a number of focus points that it thinks will give you a good focus for whatever you're taking a shot of. Now, I prefer to have control myself. If you do use multi-mode, what you'll find is that the first choice, focus area, is grayed out and we cannot select it. So if you use that, just remember you're allowing, if you're using multi-focus settings, you're allowing the camera to determine what to focus on. When you're using area settings, you could go up here to focus area and you could specifically pick the focus point you want to use. Now, you could see that there's a square there. You could make that focus point smaller or larger by turning the multifunction wheel on the back. So if I turn it to the left, I make it smaller, and if I turn it to the right, I make it larger. There are 5 different positions. The smaller you make it, the more accurate focusing you will achieve, but the camera will take longer to focus. The larger you make it, the camera will focus more quickly, but it may not be as accurate as you might want. For example, if you're focusing, let's say, on a bird's eye, a small bird, and their eye is very small. If you use the large focus area, what will happen is you might overlap, or you might get more of the bird's head in the shot than just the eye. So it might focus more on the beak or something like that, so you won't get accurate focus like you may want it to focus. If you use the smaller focus area, focus point, then you'll focus more accurately on the eye of the bird. Now, conversely, if you have a, let's say, a seascape and you're just taking a picture of the ocean and a beach, you might just be focusing a third of the way up into the scene, and you're focusing on water, and it doesn't matter which one you use. Now, there is a default position, and to achieve the default position, just push in the multifunction wheel and you'll get the default position, which is the 3rd smallest. So there's the smallest, 2nd smallest, 3rd smallest, and that is the default position. So with this, again, you could just move it anywhere you like it, and when you choose the focus point, you could hit OK, and then you're all set. You have that focus point. Now, below that is macro. The camera is able to shoot macro, and if you are going to shoot something close up, you have to put it in macro mode, and you do that there. Release focus priority, a lot of people confused about. You do it there's different settings for single focus mode and continuous focus mode. And what happens is it's called release and focus. If you have it on focus setting, the camera will not take a picture unless the scene or whatever you're focusing on is perfectly in focus. Meaning, if you are focusing and you want to take the picture and the camera is not perfectly focused, the camera will not take the picture until focus is achieved. If you're in release mode, it will take the picture even if it's not focused. So if you're out in the wilderness and Bigfoot comes walking by and you just pull out the camera and start snapping away, you'll get the pictures even if they're blurry if you're in release mode. If you're in focus mode, the camera will not take the exposure if it's not perfectly focused, and you might miss taking that picture of Bigfoot. So for that reason, I prefer to keep it in release mode for both single focus and continuous focus. I have it in release mode. Below that is instant AF setting. What that means is if the camera is in manual focus mode, when you press the shutter halfway, the camera will not focus. It is expecting you to turn the ring on the lens to focus. But this button back here, AEL, AFL, can actually focus the camera when you're in manual focus mode. How do you want that to behave? Do you want it to act as a single focus or a continuous focus? I prefer to have mine in continuous focus. So when the camera is in manual focus mode, if I want to focus, I could press this AEL, AFL button in, and the camera will focus continuously. Now we talked about the AF mode. Face detection I have off, but it works great if you're taking a picture of a portrait of a person. I'll put it in face detection, put it on, and you'll be able to get some great shots of a portrait using face detection on. Pre-AF, that means the camera's always going to be focusing. Even if you're holding it at your side and you're swinging your arms back and forth, the camera's continually going to try to focus on something. The advantage is when you are ready to frame a subject and take the picture, the camera will focus faster. The disadvantage is it drains your battery. I have it off. AF illuminator, that's the little light that comes on the front. When you press the shutter in halfway, it'll light up to help you achieve focus. I use this camera mostly for street photography, so I don't like that light going on because I don't want to be noticed out on the street taking pictures, so I keep that off. Correct AF frame. Because the viewfinder is in the top left corner of the camera, and the actual sensor and lens are more towards the middle of the camera, if you're focusing on something close, you're going to get what's called parallax distortion, meaning what you're looking at is not exactly what the picture is going to be because the lens is offset from the viewfinder. When you turn this on, when you're using macro mode, a little, like another focus point will show up through the viewfinder showing you exactly what you're focusing on as opposed to what you think you're focusing on. Since I really don't use this camera for macro, I have that off. Okay, so that are the autofocus settings. The next are ISO settings. They range from 200 to 6400, that's the natural ISO, and then you have extended settings that you could use. You also have 3 auto settings. Typically, I use this for street photography, and if it's bright outside on a typical day, I'll use ISO of 800 because this camera has great high ISO performance. And I want to make sure that I'm using a fast enough shutter speed, so I'll be in aperture priority mode, usually around f8, and I use a ISO of 800, and I usually get a very fast shutter speed doing that. Some people prefer to use auto ISO. If you do, you could set it 3 different ways. You could go into auto 1, and you have the default sensitivity. That's going to be the lowest ISO you want to use. You could put 200. The maximum sensitivity will be the maximum ISO you want to use. Let's say it's 6400. And the minimum shutter speed, in this case, 1/60th of a second is loaded in there. You could load in anything you want, though. You could go to 1/25th of a second. What that means is if the scene is getting darker and your shutter speed is going to drop below 1/125th of a second, the camera will automatically use a higher ISO, so your shutter speed will not be any slower than 1/125th of a second. I don't like that for street photography. I prefer to dial in the ISO myself. And if you watch my street photography video series, I'll be talking about why I prefer not to use auto ISO. All right, image size. This is just really for if you're shooting JPEGs. And what we'll do is we'll go down to image quality first, and you can see there's fine, normal, and then there's fine and raw, normal and raw. I usually use just raw. I shoot raw, and I encourage you to do that too. If you shoot raw, you can see that image size is grayed out. We can't choose it because it only applies to a JPEG. If you insist on shooting JPEG, shoot fine. That'll give you a better quality image. If we choose fine and raw, then you'll shoot actually on your card, on your memory card, two images will be saved, the raw image and a fine JPEG image. Now as far as image size, a 3:2 image is the typical kind of standard in the industry. It's the same as a 35mm film dimensions, 3:2. L will give you the highest resolution, and on this specific memory card that I have in here, which I think is a 64 gig, I get fit 1,471 of those images on here. If I go to a 16:9 ratio, I could fit a few more. A 1:1, which of course is square, I could fit more, and so on. So if you are shooting JPEG, shoot the highest quality possible. But again, I encourage you to just shoot raw and not worry about it. Dynamic range is more applicable to the JPEGs because you're actually baking the information into a JPEG. When you have a raw file, you have a lot of latitude, and you could get a lot of detail out of shadows and highlights when you're using a raw file. If you are using the JPEG, you may want to put this at 400%. That means the camera will try to get as much detail as possible out of the darker parts of the scene while retaining detail in the lighter parts of the scene. You may want to use auto. I'd experiment with this, see what works for you. I have it on 100%, but again, I shoot raw, so it really doesn't matter because I could tease out a lot of detail in the shadows and the highlights because of the latitude that raw file allows me. Film simulation mode, this is only applicable to a JPEG, so if you're shooting raw like me, it's not applicable. But if you are using and shooting JPEGs, you could save it as a Provia type file that will look like Provia film from Fuji back in the day when there was film was common, Velvia film, Estia film, classic chrome look, and so on. There's all these different settings. Now if you just shoot raw like I do, all those film simulations are available in the raw file. If you go in Lightroom to camera calibration, you could dial in any of these. They're all available. So that's why, again, I prefer raw, because if you shoot JPEG, that'll get baked into the JPEG and you can't change it. If you shoot raw, you could choose it later and you could switch it a week later if you want, whatever. Film simulation bracket, you could actually bracket 3 different film simulations. Say you want standard, Velvia, and Estia. You could do it and the camera will save 3 JPEG images to the memory card, all in a different film simulation. I don't use that at all. The camera has a built-in ND filter, so if the scene is very bright and you find you need to use a slower shutter speed or a wider open aperture, you could turn on the ND filter. Now, color, sharpness, highlight tone, shadow tone, all pertain to the JPEGs. So since I don't shoot JPEGs, it's no setting is involved for me. It doesn't matter. But you could actually increase color. You could give increased sharpness. You could tone the highlights with a different color. You could tone the shadows if you want to, and all that again gets baked into the JPEG. You could add noise reduction to the image. Again, I don't use any of that. I shoot RAW. I'm going to sound like a broken record about RAW, but again, you should be shooting RAW, especially if you want to advance in your photography. RAW will afford you so many more possibilities with your images. All right, long exposure noise reduction. Typically, I keep that off, although it does work great. What that does, if you're taking a long exposure, let's say a 60-second exposure, what the camera will do, it will take your 60-second exposure, then it will immediately take a 67 blank or black exposure. It will not expose the sensor to light. What that does is, once it takes that second blank or black exposure, it can look at that and it's supposed to be totally black, but the camera's computer will see real noises on that black image. It will assume that your image has noise in the exact same spots, and it will use some computer algorithms to eliminate the noise in your image. It works great, as I said, but in a 60-second exposure now takes over two minutes for you to execute. Usually, especially if you're taking, let's say, a sunset or something like that, you don't have that much time. You know, you're doing a long exposure because you're probably smoothing out the water and stuff like that, and you're trying to get as many shots in as possible. So I like to have that off. I don't like the camera to be tied up that long. I use Topaz denoise in post-production, and it gets rid of noise great. So I don't use long exposure noise reduction in camera. I have that off. Next, we're in group 3. I use white balance of auto. Again, it doesn't really matter because I'm shooting RAW. I could choose any white balance I need. It's not baked into the RAW file. If you are shooting JPEG, it gets baked into the JPEG. So you might, if you find out you're shooting auto, but the images are coming out and they're looking like green or something like that, then you might want to come in and you know, dial in a specific color temperature for the lights you're using. You might want to, if you're in the shade, put in shade. If you're in fluorescent light, you're getting that green image, then you could try one of the fluorescent light settings, things like that. Again, I just keep mine on auto, and I could correct it in post very easily because I'm shooting RAW. Select a custom setting and edit save custom settings. That has to do with the Q button and these quick settings you can do, and it pertains more to if you're shooting JPEG. I will make a separate video on these settings because it does get a little confusing and it's really not pertinent to this video. So again though, that's more pertinent to JPEG, so you could do some quick changes, like you could be shooting Velvia and all of a sudden decide you want to be in Astia, and you could hit the Q button and quickly change to a different you know, setting, and some other things too that you could switch around. And again, we'll talk about that in another video. The function buttons on the camera itself, how do you want them to behave? Function 1, which is on the top of the camera, is for video mode. Function 2 is macro mode, and it shows you exactly where the function button is. And you could change any of these to anything you want. For example, I don't really use macro mode, so I might want to change that. And I could do multiple exposure, let's say. So now that button will allow me to access multiple exposures for the camera. So that is, you know, very handy. You could actually have the function buttons do anything you want them to do. Display custom setting. Now this is what is displayed on the back display and the optical viewfinder and the electronic viewfinder when you view it. Like right now, you could see along the top, there's some information about how many shots I have left. I'm shooting RAW. Along the bottom, I'm at ISO 6400 and so on like that. And when you're in the menu here, you could actually tell it what you want it to display for the LCD. I could turn on framing guidelines and electronic level. I like to have those on. I don't care about autofocus distance or manual focus distance. You could have a histogram on, and that's more pertaining when you're looking at your shot, chimping your shot. Aperture ISO speed, I want all those on. I want to see that on my display. So that's for the LCD and the electronic viewfinder. For the optical viewfinder, I'd like the framing guideline, electronic level. I don't care about the distance, and so on. So you could do that for all the different viewfinders and LCD on the back. Conversion lens. Now this has a 23mm fixed focal length, non-interchangeable lens, but you can buy a telephoto converter for this lens or a wide angle converter for the lens. And if you put any of these on the camera, you have to tell the camera you have it on, and you would do that with that menu item. Now, manual focus assist. I prefer to have focus peak highlight. What that means is when I'm in manual focus mode and I am turning the focus dial on the lens, as it's becoming more in focus, I get these kind of white dots, similar to the old snow you would get in an old analog TV set. The more snowy you make it, the more in focus you are. And I prefer that, and tell you the truth, most people do, because it seems to work the best. Now you could make those dots either very bright white or a lower intensity white or red or blue. I prefer bright white like that. And you also could do a digital split images. Those of you that remember the old split prism, pentaprism systems back probably in the 70s and early 80s, where you actually had the image kind of split and you would manually focus the lens until the image came together. That's what that does. It doesn't work that well, I don't think, with digital cameras, so I don't use that. Standard is you're just looking at the image and getting it in focus. So I prefer, again, the focus peak highlight. I like that. Next, we have these advanced filters, which again only pertains to the JPEGs. You could do these partial colors. You could then maybe do a soft focus effect, a dynamic tone effect, a low key, a high key effect, pop color effect, a miniature or toy camera effect. A miniature is actually more like a tilt shift effect, and the toy camera is kind of an odd looking little toy camera thing. Again, these only pertain to JPEGs. It won't pertain to RAW at all. Next is interval timer shooting. This is so you could take, let's say, 100 shots and you want them 5 seconds apart or something like that. This comes in handy if you're shooting star trails and things like that. And the camera will do that. The self-timer, you have 2 seconds or 10 seconds. So if you're shooting macros with the camera and you don't have a cable release, you may want to put it on 2 seconds. That means when you press the shutter, the camera's going to count off 2 seconds before it takes the exposure. So any vibrations from you pressing the shutter dissipate by then. You can put it at 10 seconds. Maybe you want to jump in the shot. So you're taking a group photo, you have the camera on a tripod, you press the shutter, and you have 10 seconds to get in the shot. Typically, you'd have that off. AEAF lock mode. This is what this button does back here. I use it strictly for focusing, back button focusing, but you could also use it for exposure. But how do you want it to behave? For me, focusing, I want it to be focusing while I'm pressing it. What you could do, let's say you're using it for exposure, you could point it at something you want to expose properly, and you would press it once when you have it as an on-off switch, and it will hold that exposure. So no matter where you point your camera, no matter how many times you press your shutter, it's going to hold that exposure until you press it again. I prefer to have it while I'm pressing it. So even if I was using it as an exposure control, I'd hold it in and it would hold exposure while I'm holding it. Then I could press the shutter button. All right. AEAF lock button, that is what this, again, this button does. I use it for autofocus lock only. You could have it for exposure only or both. I prefer to just use it for focus, and then I'll use the shutter button for exposure. Photometry, this is whether you're using a spot metering, average metering, or multi-metering. In multi-metering, you're using the center area of the camera and that's getting more weight concerning what the camera will how the camera will determine exposure. So the center part gets a little more emphasis put to it compared to the rest of the scene. Spot metering means whatever you're using your focus point, where your focus point is, that's where metering is being performed and how the camera is going to determine exposure. That is what I prefer to have it on. Average metering, the camera looks at the entire scene and just averages it out. To tell you the truth, most professionals prefer spot metering. Interlock the spot AE and focus area, I have that on. That's, as I mentioned, as I move the focus point around, that point will be used for metering as well, as long as you have that on. If you have that off, then the camera is going to use the center spot as metering to achieve exposure. All right, red eye removal I have off. Typically I don't get red eyes when I shoot my models or anything like that. But if you do, you would have that on, and then the camera will try to eliminate red eye. Save original file, that means when you take a shot and the camera has to remove the red in someone's eye, it'll save the original image that has red eyes, and then it will save a second image of the camera itself, of it eliminating the red eyes. So you'll have two images saved to the SD card. Flash mode I have off, but you could use, if you're using external flash, you're using this as a commander. This is commanding other external flashes. You could use it as slow syncing. That's called dragging the shutter. That's for like slow shutter speeds. That's when you would use slow synchro. And force flash is you just want the flash to go off. I typically don't use the flash on this camera, so I have it off. Flash compensation. Some scenes are tricky. The camera uses TTL metering for the flash. And if you had, let's say, a very dark scene, I have a black Labrador Retriever, and if I was photographing him in a very dark room, my camera would the flash would overexpose him because it's trying to make the scene medium gray. So I would want to use some negative flash compensation in that regard. And you could go plus and minus 2 stops in flash compensation. Shutter type, you have a mechanical shutter and an electronic shutter. Now, the mechanical shutter is your typical mechanical shutter. The camera's going to make some noise when it goes off, and you are limited by how fast or slow that shutter speed can be. With an electronic shutter, it could be silent. It just is electronically taking the shot, and you could use some very, very fast shutter speeds, way faster than what the mechanical shutter speed can afford you. The disadvantage of an electronic shutter is if anything is moving through the frame, it gets distorted. And if it's moving fast, it could get distorted quite bad. Now, I use it for street photography quite often. People are walking past me and things like that. If I use the electronic shutter, just even them at walking speed, they'll come out distorted. So I prefer to use the mechanical shutter. You could use mechanical, electronic, or a combination of both. With both, when you're within the mechanical shutter speed's limits, it will use the mechanical shutter speed. But if you need to go faster than the fastest mechanical shutter speed, which off the top of my head I'm not sure what it is, then it will turn on the electronic shutter speed. I think the fastest is 1/4000th of a second, the fastest mechanical speed. So again, I just use mechanical straight. Now, if I was sitting on a bus or a train or something like that and everyone is stationary and I want my camera to be quiet, I would use electronic shutter in that situation. Now, I don't use the camera for movies myself, but if I did, I would use the best quality, 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second. The auto ISO, I'd keep it at auto. You could, if you're using a mic plugged into the side of the camera, you could adjust the mic so it doesn't clip or it's not too low. And then there's one plug on the back side of the camera. It's a 2.5 millimeter jack, and I didn't say that wrong. It's the smaller 2.5 millimeter jack. And you could use that jack as either a mic input or a remote release. And you're going to tell it here, the camera here, what you're using it for. Obviously, if you're doing movies, you probably want to use it as a microphone. And that's that. All right, next, wireless communication. I covered this in my Instax printer video, and I won't really go into it here. It's just getting the camera to communicate either with the Fujifilm app for your phone or an Instax printer. Now, if you are using the app on your phone, it really will only transfer JPEG images. So you shoot RAW like me, it's kind of worthless. So you're going to shoot some RAW images. Before you could transfer them from the camera to your phone, they have to get converted to JPEGs. Now it will do that, but it is kind of a slow process, and I just don't bother. So if you're interested in some more information about the wireless communication, take a look at my Instax printer video, and I talk about that in more detail. Okay, that is the shooting menu. Next, we're going to go to the setup menu. And this is pretty straightforward stuff. You have the date and time, time difference. If you live in New York City, but you're on vacation in Paris, you could put the time that is in Paris, the difference in time, so that your metadata in your images gets recorded correctly, so you're recording the correct day and time. Language, of course, whatever language you prefer the menus to be in. I prefer English. You could reset both the shooting menu and the setup menu with that, and of course that will reset everything. Settings. Silent mode, if you don't want anything beeping or anything like that, you'd put that on. You could see now it's not beeping anymore. Or you could put it off. Typically when I'm doing street photography, I have that on so the camera doesn't make any noise. Frame, do you want to just continuously increment your frames as you save your images to the SD card? I have mine continuous. If you have it on renew, it will go up to, I think it's 999, and then it will start over again. Focus ring, do you want to, when you're manually focusing the camera, do you want to focus clockwise or counterclockwise? Focus check, that's when you're in manual focus mode and you start to turn the focus ring on the lens. What will happen is, whether you're viewing it on the LCD or through the viewfinder, the camera will zoom in to help you focus better. Now it's not going to take that zoomed in image, it's not going to take that picture, it's just helping you focus. It will take the scene as you framed it. Sound setup, this is the actual noises the camera makes, the operation volume, these beeps you hear as I'm pressing the buttons. How loud do you want them? Or you could turn them off totally. The shutter volume, you could actually have the shutter make a noise. And how loud do you want that noise to be? I typically have that off. The actual shutter sound, hopefully you could hear that. What sound do you want to use? Since I don't like shutter sounds at all, you can see I have shutter volume off. Playback volume, so when you're playing back a video, how loud do you want that volume to be? You would change that there. And that's the sound setup. Screen setup. All right, now image display. After you take a picture, do you want it to display on the back of the camera so you could chimp it? I have mine off. I don't like to chimp. If you like to chimp, have it on. EVF auto rotate display. So through the electronic viewfinder, if you turn the camera into portrait orientation, do you want the image to swing over into the portrait orientation? I have it on. I'd like it to do that. Preview exposure and manual mode. So you have the camera manual mode and you're dialing in your own ISO setting, your own shutter speed, and your own aperture. The display will actually show you if it's really underexposed or overexposed when you have this on. Now, if you're using an external flash, this could cause you a problem because you might be in a very dark room and you're going to illuminate it with the flash, but the camera doesn't know that you're using an external flash. So you might be putting the shutter speed, let's say on 1/60th of a second, you're using ISO of 200, and you're using f-stop of f11. You'll look at the display, it's going to be so dark you can't even focus. So what you would do is you'd have to go to this setting and turn this off, and then it will just illuminate the display so you could see what you're doing, and it won't affect exposure at all. It's just what you see through the viewfinder or on the back LCD. Monitor sunlight mode, so if it's really bright outside and you can't see the back display, you would turn this on and it will brighten up and adjust contrast on the display so you can better see it in bright sunlight. EVF brightness I have on auto. You could change the brightness of the electronic viewfinder, and you could adjust color, the brightness of the LCD and the color of the LCD. I just keep those on their default 0 settings. Preview picture effect, remember those pictures we talked about, the tilt shift effect, the toy camera effect, those color effects, soft focus effects. If you have this on, you'll actually see what it looks like through the viewfinder and through on the LCD. Since I don't use those at all, I have it off. Framing guidelines. I like grid 9. That's like the rule of thirds, and you'll actually have the grid on the back LCD and or through the viewfinder. And that helps you, of course, compose your subjects. You might prefer a 24 grid or no framing at all. Again, I prefer the grid 9. Auto rotate on playback. So if you're looking at your images and it's a vertical image, it would typically go vertically, and you would have to physically spin the camera sideways to look at a vertical image. If you have auto rotate on, it'll just auto rotate the image so you don't have to physically turn the camera sideways to look at a vertical image. Focus scale units, since I'm in the US, I use feet. Most of you probably will use meters. Image display, this is how long the image gets displayed on the back. Half a second, 1.5 seconds, or continuously. I have it off. Okay, that's it for the screen setup part of the menu. Now we're going to go down to the selector button setting. Now what do these selector buttons here? Do you want them to be function buttons or do you want them to be focus area buttons? I prefer them to be function buttons, but you could make them focus area buttons. And when they are, what happens is, as soon as you touch them, you're automatically moving the focus point around. If you don't want them to be that, let's go back down there, and you have it on the function button, they'll act as a normal function button. So you could get into different function settings. If I did want to move that focus point though, this function button right here allows me to do it. So I click that and then I could move it around. So that's what I prefer. I prefer to have more function buttons than there are, than to get to the focus points. That's just the way I prefer to do it. Edit, save, quick menu. This is the quick menu that we talked about, and I will talk about that more in another video. Power management, auto power off, I have it set for 2 minutes. The optical viewfinder power save mode I have off, and high performance I have on. If you use high performance and have it on, the camera will focus a little quicker, so that's why I prefer it on. It will put a little more drain on your battery though. Shutter count, 600 shots, nothing, how many counts on your shutter. Edit file name, you could change how the camera saves the files and how it names the beginning of the file. With a color space sRGB, it will use DSCF, and DSF for Adobe RGB. Those are the default settings. I just leave them. It doesn't matter to me. Wireless settings, again, I'll talk about that. I talked about that in the Instax video. You could watch that. PC autosave settings, that's how when you hook the camera up to your computer, how does it work? How does it operate? How do you set it up? I don't use it at all. I pull the SD card out of the camera and put the SD card in my computer. I don't hook the camera up directly, nor do I use the camera tethered. So that is not applicable to me at all. Geotagging setup, that's with the app with your phone. You could actually have the images tagged with your location when you take the image, but you have to use it in conjunction with your phone. It's really kind of clumsy in my opinion, and I don't use that at all. Instax printer connection setting, again, I cover that in the Instax video. Color space. There's sRGB and Adobe RGB. The best way to think about this is sRGB is like a box of 8 different color crayons, and Adobe RGB is like a box of 24 different color crayons. I prefer to have as many colors available as possible until I'm ready to print the image, and then I really have to make a decision. Usually it's sRGB, but I'll stay with Adobe RGB at the beginning here. This will format your SD card when you enter that, and that is the complete setup menu. So that's it. That's the two main menus, the shooting menu and the setup menu on the Fujifilm X100t. I hope that helps you guys and it answered some of your questions. All right, that's it. I'll talk to you guys soon.